Okay, good afternoon / good morning, grade 11. So today we're going to look at conventions of a Shakespearean tragedy. So in today's lesson, you're going to first of all, we're going to define what the conventions of Shakespearean tragedy are, and you are going to learn how to plot Macbeth using Freytag's pyramid. So for this, you're going to need Macbeth, obviously, and you're going to need your study guides, because that's where you're going to be working on today. Our key concepts still, a bit of identity, perspective, representation, and hopefully at the end of this you'll be slightly more knowledgeable. So what are the conventions of a Shakespearean tragedy? So a Shakespearean tragedy typically includes the following aspects. You have a fatal flaw, or hamartia. You have good versus evil. You have a conflict, which can be internal or external, or sometimes both. You have the idea that the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And you have an external pressure on our protagonist. And you have a 5-act structure. So I'm going to talk through each of these one by one. So the fatal flaw, or hamartia. So hamartia is Greek for sin or error, and this refers to the fatal flaw in our protagonist. So unlike sort of in Greek tragedy, where there's not really a sense of free will, sort of the final outcome is sort of ordained by fate, in Shakespeare the protagonist has the chance to make the right decision, and sometimes multiple chances to do the right thing, to make the right decision, to choose the right path. But because of the flaw in their character, they make the wrong decisions. And this is a quote from A.C. Bradley that I think sums this up really well. The calamities and catastrophe follow inevitably from the deeds of men, and the main source of these deeds is character. Next we have good versus evil. So they often contain the conflict between the theme of good versus evil, and this is tragedy, so invariably evil always triumphs. And one of the reasons why is that whilst goodness that we see is open and visible and talked about, evil is hidden and deceitful. And so while the audience, we may see this through, the use of dramatic irony, the protagonist doesn't until it's too late. And Edward Dowden says about this that tragedy is conceived by Shakespeare is concerned with the ruin or restoration of the soul and the life of man. In other words, its subject is the struggle of good and evil in the world. So of course we have conflict, and the conflict can be both, but it can be internal conflict. So this is when the protagonist and other characters will have doubts and conflict in their minds about what course of action to take. So they may be racked with guilt, with jealousy, with paranoia. Or it can be external conflict, where our protagonist has conflict with other characters and events, and this is often a physical conflict, and yet the protagonist will never be able to ultimately triumph through these means. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. So it's very noticeable that Shakespeare often uses noblemen or men of stature as his protagonists. And so thus, when they fall, it sort of exaggerates the tragic nature of their tale. The stakes are much higher. And you've got to remember that in Shakespeare's time, often nobility were amongst the few who were educated. So their downfall can show that evil can affect even the mightiest. And of course we have external pressure. So like external conflicts, our protagonist faces pressure from external places. And this may come from, for example, the supernatural. Obviously in Macbeth it may come from an antagonist. And last but not least is the structure, which is a 5-act plot. So in part 1 you have the exposition. This outlines the situation, introduces the main character, begins the action. Part 2, we have the rising action. So this is the development of the action. This is often where the complication is introduced. Part 3, we have the crisis or climax, and this brings everything to its head. So in this part, we have a fundamental change of direction. This is often the last chance the protagonist has to make the right decision. And from this point on, their sort of fate is sealed. They don't know this, We, the audience, may guess this, but this is where, if you want to chart them from good and evil, this is where they go from having good intentions to being evil. Part 4 is the falling action, and there's often conflict here between our protagonists and other characters. We, the audience, are still possibly unsure if they will escape their fate. Certainly the protagonist, still believes that they may escape their fate. And in part 5, we have the denouncement or resolution. And this is where the final crisis or action or revelation and resolution are explained. So this is where you have your final action, and this is where you have some form of resolution. Although it's worth saying that resolution doesn't necessarily mean that poetic justice is served. And in Shakespeare's tragedies, poetic justice, the idea of people getting their just rewards, doesn't always happen. So Freytag's pyramid, which I'm sure you have studied before when looking at how to develop a plot. So first of all, we have the exposition, and this, as I said, introduces. Then you have the rising action, which builds conflict, and then that leads to the climax, and this is where the fatal flaw of the protagonist seals their fate. Then you have the falling action, the protagonist battles against other characters, they try to escape their fate, but ultimately leads to the resolution and denouncement, a returning to the natural order, but not necessarily justice. So what you have to do today is, in your study guides, we're looking at number 2 now, so plot and conventions of a tragedy. So first of all, your plot summary. If you haven't done this, I really suggest, instead of just writing it out, do a diagram, do a flowchart. This will help with your revision later. Add conventions of a tragedy with examples from Macbeth. So you've got space for conventions of a tragedy. So there are 6 different conventions. You need to possibly have a page for each, give a definition, and give examples from Macbeth. Then I want you to draw Freytag's pyramid, adding in key points from Macbeth. Not the whole plot, because you won't be able to, but just the key points. It's very easy to draw. I did it just on Google Slides using lines. It's not difficult. And that is all you're going to do for today. We may do this in tomorrow's lesson as well, depending on how long it takes. And as ever, don't forget to take attendance. I will be on Google Classroom. I will be on Google Hangouts for any questions. And enjoy the lesson.